21 years after the United States started its war on terror, what has it achieved? Hello, I'm Arlen Vine, and this is The Heat. This Sunday, September 11th, marks 21 years since the most devastating terror attack on U.S. soil. Nearly 3,000 people were killed at the hands of terrorists in New York, Washington, D.C., and a fourth plane which crashed into a Pennsylvania field. More than 2 decades of U.S. overseas military intervention followed at enormous human and financial cost. Owen Fairclough looks at the numbers.
Our war on terror begins with al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
But that war on terror to avenge the 9/11 attacks did end.
Last night in Kabul, the United States ended 20 years of war in Afghanistan, the longest war in American history.
The chaotic withdrawal was a humiliating conclusion to a period that took US military forces and contractors beyond Afghanistan to Iraq, Pakistan, Syria and Yemen to root out Islamic terror. Brown University estimates this war on terror period claimed up to 929,000 lives worldwide, while the US devoted $5.8 trillion on war spending, with $2.2 trillion dedicated to veterans' care until 2050. That's $8 trillion, the White House estimating that the war spending alone equated to up to $300 million per day.
And to put that in historic context, the US spent a mere $4.7 trillion in today's dollars during the 3 years and 9 months it was engaged in fighting the Second World War across multiple fronts, from Europe to the Pacific, and memorialized here in Washington, D.C.
During that withdrawal from Afghanistan, President Biden attempted to quantify the expenditure.
Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it has always been: preventing a terrorist attack on America's homeland.
And by that measure, there has been nothing on the scale of 9/11, though there have been scores of atrocities investigated as terror attacks, including the 2015 massacre of 14 people in California by a husband and wife who had discussed jihad, though their exact motive has never been established. And a Pew Research poll found most Americans think the ruling Taliban in Afghanistan represent a threat to the US, though Biden thinks this lies elsewhere.
There's a greater danger from ISIS and al-Qaeda and all these affiliates in other countries by far than there is from Afghanistan.
As the debate over the merits of 20 years of US overseas conflict continues, commemorating it is also proving exorbitant.
The cost of a proposed global war on terror monument to be built in the same vicinity as memorials to other US wars in Korea and Vietnam has reportedly doubled to $100 million, partly due to the inflation crisis. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
To discuss the impact of the U.S. war on terror, let's bring in our panelists here in Washington, D.C. Ivan Eland is a senior fellow and director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. Also in D.C., Brian Becker is the executive director of the Answer Coalition. And from McLean in Virginia, John Sitilides is a geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Ivan Eland, let me start with you. As we heard, the war on terror began in Afghanistan in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, but rapidly expanded to other parts of the world. In some instances, it involved invasions of countries. We saw the invasion of Iraq, which was based on a false pretext and false accusations. You've written extensively about this. You also point out that Sudan, North Korea, Syria, they joined Iran as sponsors of global terrorism. What is your sense of this war on terror and what it has achieved thus far?
Well, I think it's been an abject failure. I mean, we're still fighting in most of these places. Afghanistan is the exception, I think, but we're still doing a lot of shadow wars in various countries. And we're not the only one. France is also doing it, but they had to pull out of Mali because their mission failed, and I would say that the U.S. mission in all these places has failed. The problem is it's not just a war on terror, but it's also a war of development, more or less. We're still trying to convert some of these countries to democracy, and that really has to be done organically. It has to bubble up from the bottom. And in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, they've all been failures, and we've left the countries a mess. And so I think it would be a good idea if we really reconsider this war after the expenses that you just mentioned and all the deaths that have happened, both of U.S. service people and, of course, mostly in the countries that we've conducted the wars in.
Ivan, as you point out, there were many aims in this war. One was to root out terrorism. Of course, the other that you pointed out was to try and get these countries to adopt a democracy in the U.S. image. But it wasn't a clearly defined war, was it? I mean, was it the U.S. has been at war with many, many countries? Was it an excuse for the U.S. to attack any country that did not obey its particular diktat? Was it more about politics than about national security?
Well, I think certainly I'm not saying it didn't start out by national security. I mean, 9/11 was a very traumatic event, and I think that the American people put pressure on George W. Bush to do something. The problem is he did too much. He did the exact thing that was causing the terrorism in the first place. Bin Laden kept complaining about U.S. interventionism in the Middle East, but of course, Bush didn't pay attention to him. He said, they're attacking our freedoms, which was not true. And Osama bin Laden became very irate at that. And he said, well, then why am I not attacking Sweden, which is a free country? So this was decided that he was going to use the 9/11 attacks to go after Saddam Hussein. And I've never really been able, and I don't think anybody else has really been able to discern why he did that. All the other excuses, weapons of mass destruction, alleged links between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, and also to promote democracy, none of those seem to really hold water. So I think they just went big, and he said right in that speech that you quoted there, terrorists of a global reach, we're going to get them all. And I thought at the time, and I'm still thinking that that's just an open-ended invitation. And these resolutions that Congress passed, they're not terribly broad, but they just simply ignored them and went wherever they wanted to.
Right. And
they were supposed to go after Al-Qaeda and be done with it. But of course, they went much further than that. I think that was very intentional, especially when they really wanted to go into Iraq. And they used the 9/11 to get there. And they diverted attention from getting bin Laden and the other Al-Qaeda people so that they go into Iraq.
All right, at this stage, we welcome to the show Ambassador Omar Samad. He is a former Afghan ambassador to France and Canada, and he is the non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. Ambassador, glad you could join us. Great to see you. We're talking about the war on terror, which began in Afghanistan, in your country, began right after the 9/11 attacks. The goal, of course, was to drive out Al-Qaeda and to make sure that Afghanistan would never again be used as a launch pad for another attack. The war started, it became an occupation. The United States was there for 20 years. What is your assessment of the war on terror in Afghanistan and what it did to that country?
Well, 20 years is a very long time to begin with. Afghans thought that this would end sooner. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, the war that focused on Afghanistan expanded, as your other guest alluded to, and became not just a war on one particular group, but it became a war waged in several countries, uprooting millions of people, killing hundreds of thousands, unfortunately. And in Afghanistan, and as you know, we think that more than 250,000 Afghans, not counting the Taliban, because we really do not know how many of them died, have died over the last 20 years. At least 1.5 million have been displaced. as a result of this war. Obviously, millions came back to Afghanistan. They thought that peace and stability was now part of the normal situation in Afghanistan. And the United States and others were helping. A lot of money was spent, 2.3 trillion according to Brown University. Some people say 1 trillion just on Afghanistan. We do know that the numbers hover over 200 billion for just the Afghan government to rebuild itself. A major nation building, state building endeavor. Many people made a lot of money. A lot of money was lost or maybe wasted in so many different ways. And at the end, it became a house of cards. It all crumbled. Unfortunately, the Afghan army, after sustaining 70,000 deaths under Ashraf Ghani, couldn't do it anymore because the system that was set up was not the right system.
Right.
The infrastructure was not the right infrastructure. The institutions were not the right institutions. So overall, we tried to do a lot of good, and we helped a lot of people. We spent a lot of money. A lot of people died, and eventually the Taliban came back.
John Sitilides, what are your thoughts on the war on terror 21 years after the 9/11 attacks?
Anand, it's very important that we conduct very accurate and thorough assessments of what has worked and what has not worked over the past 20 years. I'd like to add a little bit of context to the initiation of the war on terror, because we not only had an act of catastrophic terrorism that murdered 3,000 Americans that fateful day, but we also had intelligence, and actually Osama bin Laden publicly announced in 1998 that al-Qaeda would be actively seeking nuclear weapons and chemical and biological weapons if it could attain them and convert them into weapons. So we were very concerned about other possible mass catastrophic terror attacks against not only the United States. Keep in mind, this was really still in the unipolar moment after the collapse of the Soviet Union. China had not risen to the level that it has today, neither had Russia, and so the United States took it upon itself to also protect its European allies, because in the years after the 9/11 attacks, we had mass attacks in London, in Madrid, in Istanbul. So we had a number of very vulnerable countries to this kind of radical Islamist terrorism. So it was with that in mind that the United States undertook the war. But as your guests are mentioning, I think correctly to the extent that they're focused on the transformation of a war on terror into nation-building exercises and the interventionist idea that we could basically export Western values and institutions to countries and societies that utterly rejected these values and institutions. And that was a great mistake, I think, looking back. I think it'll also clarify the policy debate in Washington about any potential conflicts in which we may become involved, so that A, we have clear strategic objectives, and B, much clearer exit strategies so the American people and our allies know what it is exactly we seek to achieve, how we seek to achieve it, and how to declare an end to hostilities.
Brian Becker, when United States leaders are questioned about the war on terror, how it's being conducted, what it's achieved, they're very quick to point out that since the 9/11 attacks 21 years ago, there has not been an attack of that magnitude in the United States, and therefore the war has been a success.
I'd say that the war on terror has been a cynical pretext used by the United States to carry out wars and occupations against other governments and trying to topple other governments in violation of the UN Charter. It's become a banner rather than an actual war. The UN Charter says the use of force or violence against another member nation of the UN can only be justified on the circumstance of imminent self-defense. And here you have the United States invaded Iraq. The United States knew absolutely that Iraq had nothing to do with September 11th. The Lancet Medical Journal, as of 2010, said that as many as 1 million Iraqis had died who would not have otherwise died. That's not counting the wars in Yemen, the drone attacks against the people in Somalia, the war in Libya, again, all under the pretext of the war on terror, where NATO bombed and destroyed a sovereign government. The U.S. wasn't trying to build democracy in Libya. They were trying to destroy a government and take over a country where the country in Africa that had the largest oil reserves. I mean, this has been an unmitigated disaster for people all around the world. The U.S. Assumed that it had the right to torture and set up black torture sites, hidden sites all around the world. Guantanamo today is still open. Guantanamo has been labeled by the United Nations as a torture center. So I'd say the U.S. cynically used the terrible events on September 11th, and I lived right by the World Trade Center. I had friends in the World Trade Center. I know about the grief and the rage and the anger, but this was George W. Bush and the neocons using this terrible tragedy, this terrible attack, to carry out a new foreign policy, a very aggressive foreign policy, where the U.S. was going to take out those governments in the world, in resource-rich parts of the world, that were, products of the anti-colonial period. So I think this is a cynical pretext. It's been an unmitigated disaster. The only thing it succeeded in is killing a lot of people and making some people very, very rich. It's been very, very good for the U.S. military-industrial complex.
Ivan, you reminded us of something interesting a moment ago when you said that George Bush had been telling us that this was an attack on freedom. If we look at the impact that the war on terror has had on the United States and its values, I mean, in the aftermath of 9/11, we saw the Patriot Act, we saw secret FISA courts, we saw mass surveillance by the National Security Agency. Brian just mentioned torture, black sites around the world, Guantanamo Bay. That had a big impact on the United States itself and compromised United States values, didn't it?
Yes, and this is not the first time that this has happened. These long wars like the Cold War or the War on Terror are harder on our American Republic than shorter wars, because shorter wars, usually civil liberties take a hit, but then they ease up after the war is over. The problem with these wars, like Cold War, War on Terror, is they just go on forever. As we're pointing out here, 20 years, and what do we got for it? And that is the worst part of the whole thing. I think it's even worse. Well, certainly the people dying is probably the worst, but the second worst part is what it's done to our republic. And Americans, the founding generation of America, knew that war was bad for republics, and they turned them into more centralized government. And the current generation of American leaders and probably future generations will have a hard time, remembering that as well. So this is a major problem, especially when you have an attack on your own soil. And yes, the torture, the surveillance, the violation of habeas corpus, which is your right to challenge detention, all that went up in flames with the War on Terror.
Ambassador Summer, you were talking a moment ago about the Brown University reports on the War on Terror. The latest report tells us that the War on Terror claimed 900,000 lives, and some estimates say the war in Afghanistan killed 250,000 people, of which something like 20% were civilians. So, as we heard, that war against terror in Afghanistan evolved into nation building. What did it do to Afghan society?
Well, Afghan society today is so fragmented, and I cannot even describe the fragmentation that we underwent over the last 20 years, especially under Ashraf Ghani. No one trusts anyone anymore. Obviously, the Taliban are in control and are imposing their will, at times by force, but the country is under the control of one group after decades, and has some level of security and safety, even though Daesh, ISK is still a threat, and there are other outfits, including the ones that our neighbors fear. But Afghan society has changed in some positive ways, but also in very negative ways. Tens of thousands of people may have benefited from trillions of dollars that were spent, but this is a country of almost 40 million people. The rest still live under the line of poverty. Today, more than 95% of Afghans earn less than $2 a day, and as you know, the economic situation is really bad. So if you look at the long-term perspective, all those efforts amounted to something that was not sustainable. The foundations were weak, the infrastructures crumbled or were not properly built. And there are a lot of lessons, and I always talk about the lessons that we need to learn from the last 20 years, Afghanistan being a prime example, and so many other hotspots that unfortunately flared up during these past 20 years, and so many people who were hurt by it. At the end of the day, if it's about counterterrorism, obviously there are still people saying we need to go back to Afghanistan, we need to finish the job, or there's still a threat. I think that the appetite for war doesn't exist. The Afghans do not want war anymore. They want a peaceful settlement, which didn't occur as a result of the fleeing of the ex-president at the last minute. But at the same time, I think that it has split the world into, again, East-West, and we see Ukraine emerging as a major hotspot again. Overall, I think Afghanistan continues to suffer, and the end result wasn't what we expected.
Right. Just one quick point, Ambassador, when we talk about counterterrorism. When we look at the number of civilians who have been killed in Afghanistan, did this war on terror in Afghanistan have perhaps the unintentional effect of actually making that threat even bigger? It perhaps radicalized many, many people in Afghanistan, especially the young people.
Remember that the initial threat, and I was one of those in Washington before 9/11 warning about the fact that we need to do something about Afghanistan before it hits us, but nobody was really listening. But remember, the threat was not an Afghan threat. It wasn't, even the Taliban who were ruling at the time didn't know about it from all the documents we have. It was an outfit like Al-Qaeda that had found space in Afghanistan. Okay. So what we do today is prevent that from happening again, and we need to engage all the sides to make sure that that doesn't happen, including the neighborhood and countries around Afghanistan.
Okay, John Sitilides, President Biden talked about war on terror during his last address at the United Nations General Assembly. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
U.S. military power must be our tool of last resort, not our first. It should not be used as an answer to every problem we see around the world.
So there we hear the President John saying that U.S. military power should be the last resort. But according to that Brown University report, the United States is currently conducting military operations as part of its war on terror in something like 80 countries. So in view of that, what do you make of the President's statement?
I don't know anything about this Brown University study and how accurate its assessments and determinations are. The United States does enjoy basing rights in dozens of countries around the world. These are governments that welcome the United States to help provide domestic security and to provide assistance and training for their military forces so they can defend their sovereignty either against internal threats such as terrorism or external threats. So that handles that matter. But I think also, Anand, what would be an interesting area to explore, and one of the great things about living in a liberal democracy is we get to have these open discussions and debates from all sides and all perspectives, honestly and sometimes painfully, about what's taking place so we avoid these errors in the future. And one area where perhaps the great powers that are now caught up in a rivalry that will likely dominate the international landscape in the years ahead as we close out 20 years of a so-called war on terrorism and transition to great power rivalries, is to see where the U.S. and Russia could have worked more closely together to deal with the radical Islamist threat from the underbelly, from Central Asia, and even the U.S. and China with the East Turkmenistan terrorists that have caused the Beijing regime to enact these policies that are causing so much consternation in Xinjiang. So I think there are areas where we can learn lessons from an American perspective and also an international cooperation perspective, and it's unfortunate we're not moving in that direction.
Okay, Brian Becker, if we look at a graph of military spending since 1990, this is well before the 9/11 attacks, it was high but pretty flat at that time. Then it shoots up in 2001. It is now almost 3 times as high as it was in 2001. But if we look at the response to that growing military expenditure, there is really a murmur, really a protest from the American public, from the people who cast votes for the government. And this is a country where, need I remind you, that there are 40 million people who go to bed hungry every night. There are millions of people who have no health care. There's almost 500,000 people who have no homes, who are totally homeless. Why has there been no concern? Why hasn't this been a bigger debate in the country, this level of military expenditure?
Yeah, to me, that is the paramount question. Why no debate? Why have we adopted, for instance, major power conflict as if we're preparing now for World War III without an active debate about that inside of Congress, when obviously the desire by the Pentagon and by policymakers and members of Congress to achieve military primacy or supremacy over America's so-called adversaries or foes, particularly China and Russia. How could this be without a debate? And I think the explanation is there is no debate within the U.S. mainstream media. It's not tolerated. I mean, people like myself, I was one of the leaders of the anti-war movement in the Iraq War. 25 years ago, we could get on network TV. We were on CNN. We were on cable network news. But starting with the Iraq War and after September 11th, the voices of people opposed to the accelerating trend towards militarization have been basically muted. And inside Congress, even the liberals, even like Bernie Sanders or AOC or the Squad, there's hardly a murmur from them, because if you stand up against the U.S. military industrial complex and its dominance over the political life in this country, you're considered either weak on defense or possibly a traitor or possibly a proxy for foreign adversaries. There's kind of a pro-war, pro-military spending witch hunt in this country that makes debate very unlikely. And as a consequence, the people of this country, who are, as you've said, really suffering very deep, profound economic problems, they're not entitled to a debate. And that's part of the role, I think, of the anti-war movement, is to try, in spite of all of the odds, to instigate or have a debate, because when you spend almost $1 trillion a year, every year, that's what the U.S. is spending on military, and it's growing because of the Ukraine conflict, this incentivizes more war, because you make big money. It's one of the big sectors of the economy, is to build more weapons, more missiles, more bombs, and send troops into faraway places for more wars. If that's a form of incentive for business, that means war is more likely. That's why we need a debate. And unfortunately, there's no debate. We say we're a free society, we're an open democracy. Why is there no debate on this, the most vital of all questions?
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Time has caught up with us. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.